to this day as well, on the Lord's Day, we can get together and sing praises to God, open up His Word, and learn more about who He is and who He calls us to be. It is the fifth Sunday, so I have the privilege of sharing some thoughts with you from the Word of God today. And I've been praying, and I've been hoping that the things we talk about will be helpful to you and will encourage you with your walk with the Lord. I was thinking as we were singing this morning, what a foretaste of heaven it was. I love that Justin got us together, that we could circle around and look at each other. Thank you, Amanda. And that we could look at each other, and I just kept thinking, I'm longing for the day that we'll never have to part ways. And we can be in each other's presence forever, for eternity, getting to sing God's praise and honor Him and worship Him forever. And so I'm looking forward to that. This morning, I want to talk to you about discipleship. And the reason I got to thinking about this subject for this week is I came across a quote from a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. But he wrote a book on discipleship, and it got me thinking about this topic. And he said this, that when Christ calls a man, He bids him to come and die. And that's a challenging thought, isn't it? That when Jesus calls us to come and follow Him, He bids us to come and die to ourselves. No longer live for me, but for Him who died for me. If you ever spent time in the Gospels, you know that Jesus says some difficult and challenging things, albeit radical things, to those who He calls to follow Him. Jesus would say something like this, that if it would stop you from sinning, pluck out your eye and cast it from you. And He's not saying that literally. Don't go home and do that, please. But He's saying that the disciples should take sin that seriously. That you would have that kind of attitude towards sin, not to let anything get in your way from following the Lord. He would say in Luke chapter 9, where He talks to several people who keep making excuses why they couldn't follow Him. And He would say, no one after putting their hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. You can't say that you're going to follow me and keep looking back to what used to be. You've got to be focused on what's ahead. And so we're familiar with that idea, right? We're familiar with the cost of discipleship. He calls us to a high calling. There is a real cost for us if we're going to follow Him. But why? Why does Jesus ask so much of us? Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a disciple and you've been thinking about that. You've been thinking about following Jesus and becoming a Christian, but you think about the cost and you're not sure. Maybe you're a disciple and you've been reconsidering your commitment to the Lord. Maybe you've been thinking about all the things that Jesus calls you to do and you're thinking, I don't know anymore. I want to say this. Even if Jesus didn't have anything greater in mind, He would still be worthy of our following Him for the sole fact that He died for us. When Jesus calls you to be a disciple, He is not trying to make your life harder. He wants better for you. He wants good for you. He wants to do something in your life and change you and make your life different than what it is now. And so this morning, I want to spend some time with you talking about the cost and blessings of discipleship. And I want to emphasize the blessing part because I don't know if I always think about that. That yes, there's a cost, but I want you to think about the spiritual blessings that come when you decide to follow Jesus. And as a disciple, if you've already done that, these are things that will remind you that Jesus is worth it. He is worth following Him and giving your life to Him. So there's going to be three passages we look at, and the lesson will be yours. Look at Matthew chapter 4 with me. Go to Matthew chapter 4. We're going to look at verses 18 through 22. Matthew 4, 18 through 22. he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Immediately, he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. And he called them. And immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So Jesus is now beginning what would be 3.5 years of his ministry. And he's going out, if you look at verse 17, to preach that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And he calls his first disciples in this passage, two sets of brothers, Peter and Andrew, James and John, and we know that they're fishermen. They're going out, they're casting their nets, they're mending their nets, getting ready to go fishing. And Jesus says, "Follow me." And I want you to appreciate, they leave everything and follow him immediately. There's no hesitation. Luke 5, we're not going to turn there, but gives us a little bit of a deeper account of this passage, where Jesus does a miraculous thing and has their nets full of fish, and they follow him. This isn't their first interaction with Jesus, but when he says, "Come and follow me," they do that immediately. Why? I want you to think just for a moment about the cost in this passage. When Jesus says, "Follow me," there is a real cost for them as they follow Jesus. When he says, "Follow me," he's extending the invitation to be a disciple. And if you know, the idea of a disciple is someone who adheres to the teaching of someone else. It is literally a learner. Being a disciple is so much more than that. It's not just learning from the teacher. It is literally adopting their way of life. Their life becomes your life. Your life is no longer your own. You're following them. You're going with them. Wherever they go, you go. Discipleship is about giving our complete allegiance and commitment to the one that we're following. I want you to think about the real cost for these men as they go out and follow Jesus. Number one, they would leave their jobs behind. These men probably had spent all of their life preparing to be fishermen at some point. We think about fishing kind of as a leisure thing, right? We go out fishing on the lake one day, but for them, this was their job. This was a way that they brought money for their family, provided food and clothing and shelter, and they would leave that behind to follow Jesus. Not only that, they would leave their families, their homes, and their hometown. We know that Matthew chapter 8 and verse 14, Peter has a wife. Can you imagine that conversation? Peter comes into the house and says, "Honey, I'm leaving for a little while. I don't know when I'm coming back, but I'm going to be gone." And he's not like he has a phone to call her and let her know, "Hey, this is where I'm at." Do you think that would have been difficult for him? Like challenging to leave family behind, brothers, sisters, parents. Even more, leaving your hometown. Some of you are going off to college, leaving your hometown for the first time. That's a scary and frightening thing, right? You're going to somewhere that you don't know, leaving what you do know that is comfortable. And so there was a cost for them. When we follow Jesus, it means that sometimes we're going to leave things behind. Our life is completely different. It's changed. It's new. We have or changed from the inside out. But why would somebody do that? Why should we do that? Why should you do that? Why should you become a disciple? Well, the first thing, as far as blessings go, I want you to notice that, first of all, following Jesus, the blessing is that he brings purpose to our lives. He brings purpose and meaning and fulfillment to your life. Look at verse 19. What did Jesus say he was going to do for them? And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will do what? I will make you fishers of men." He was going to do something with their life. He was going to change them. He was going to give them a new purpose that they didn't have before. They had once been drawing fish up out of the sea. Now they're going to draw people to the kingdom of heaven. What they're about to do is going to have eternal impact. Think about what we know, when you think about Peter and Andrew and James and John, what do you think of them? Do you remember them as fishermen or fishers of men? Men who went out and preached the gospel, who changed people's lives eternally. You know that Jesus wants to give you purpose. He wants to give you meaning. He wants to give you fulfillment. And there's nothing here that can give that for us. Isn't finding some kind of meaning in life what we strive for? To feel like what I'm doing has value, that is important, that is making a difference. And people will do all sorts of things to find that in this life. People will see, if I could just have a couple of extra zeros in my bank account, maybe that would give me purpose. If I could get that new job with a new status and all maybe that's going to give me purpose. There's a story I came across this week. I don't know how I found it, but it was really impactful to me. Found it on ESPN. There was a guy named, I'm about to really butcher this name, Slava Medvedenko. He used to play basketball for the Lakers and won 2 NBA championships. He played with some of the greats, Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal. But he's also from the country of Ukraine, where there's lots of war and horrible things going on. He made this statement that he would sell both of his championship rings to provide new sport complexes for the children of Ukraine. And he said this. He went out to one of the tallest buildings in the city of Kiev, and he looked out all the devastation. He saw rockets flying across at night, and he said this. In this moment, I just decided, why do I need these rings if they're just sitting in my safe? He said, if I just recognize I can die. After that, I just say I have to sell them to show people leadership, to help my Ukrainian people to live better and to help kids. Here's why I bring that up. From the world standpoint, this guy had it all, right? He had status. He played with some of the greats. Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal. He had wealth. He had possessions. He had all the things that people strive after in life to find some kind of meaning, some kind of purpose. What did he recognize? It's just stuff. It's just rings. They're sitting in my safe. I've done nothing with them. And if I die, what's the purpose? He wanted to be part of something bigger than himself. Do you recognize as a disciple you get to do that? Like what you're doing today, why you follow Jesus as you go out and spread the gospel of the kingdom, what you're doing not just impacts the here and now, but it impacts people's lives eternally. You get to share the greatest news in all the world. That people can be saved from their sin and be with God in heaven. That gives us purpose. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 and 58? Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because your toil is not in vain. What you're doing is important. Following Jesus brings purpose. Let's look at a second passage. Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9. The second time Jesus calls someone to follow him. And I want to be reading in verse 9. Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. It says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in a tax collector's booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he got up and followed him. It happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why is your teacher eating with tax collectors and sinners? And when Jesus heard this, he said, it is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Here's the second time that we find Jesus saying to someone, come, follow me. And it's Matthew, the tax collector. Um, Incidentally, Matthew is the one who wrote this gospel, so it's a biography of himself. And you probably know from sermons and lessons and Bible classes what people thought of tax collectors in the first century. That they were hated. They were thought of greedy people, people who were siding with the Romans. Everybody just hated and abhorred and despised tax collectors. But Jesus says, I want you to follow me. And immediately, Matthew does that. He gets up and follows him, but he doesn't just follow him. He invites other people to come and know Jesus, other sinners and tax collectors. And as the Pharisees, I don't know how they saw this. Like, were they peering in through a window or something? Saw Jesus sitting at a table with all of these low people of society and said, why does he doesn't go to, they don't go to Jesus. They go to his disciples and say, why does your teacher do that? If he's the Son of God, the Messiah, why is he spending time with sinners? Jesus doesn't even give them an opportunity to respond. He says, this is the people I came for. People who are sick and need a physician to be well, to be healed, to be forgiven. And I want you to think about the cost for a minute. For Matthew, for sinners and tax collectors, there was a cost, a high cost. Matthew would leave that trade behind and never go back to doing that. Can you imagine the conversation that would happen with Jesus at the table with these tax collectors and sinners saying, listen, I'm coming so that you would repent and enter into the kingdom of heaven. That he would call them to turn from their sinful ways to a new life of following him. It's a real cost. And this cost is the same for you and me today. Paul tells us in Romans 3 and 23, we have all sinned. We've all looked at our life and we can recognize that we have sinned, and sin has made a mess of our lives, and we can look back with shame and regret of all the things that we've done. And just because we become children of God, we're baptized into Christ, doesn't mean that always things get better. I think sometimes we think that. But discipleship is tough. Those same temptations you had before you became a Christian are going to be there. Those same struggles that you had are going to be there. You and I know how difficult it is to put sin behind us in the rearview mirror and move forward to following Jesus. And maybe someone's saying, I don't know about that. Can I remind you of the blessing? That if you would choose to do that, choose to follow Jesus, put your sin in the past, Jesus brings healing, brings forgiveness, complete forgiveness. Some of you, we all gone to the doctor. And maybe you go to the doctor and they give you like a list of things to do. And if you want to be well, if you want to be healed, you've got to take these pills at a certain time of day for like over and over and over all day. And you've got to change your diet, and you've got to start exercising more, get more sleep, all these things. And you think, doc, that's a lot. Yeah, but I want you to be healed. Same thing is true with Jesus. He asks a lot of us. It's not easy putting sin to death, but it's a prescription to healing. It's not that we're earning it. He offers that to us. But he calls us to make radical changes in our lives. Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 24, he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you are healed. What a blessing to know that where you are this morning, maybe you come and you are burdened by the weight of sin. It doesn't have to be that way. You can find complete healing, complete forgiveness, complete pardon in Jesus. Last passage. Matthew chapter 11. A couple pages over. This is probably one of the greatest invitations that has ever been offered in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 11 is probably a very familiar passage to you. And I want to read verses 28 through 30. Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Listen to what Jesus is inviting you and I to do. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." If you look back in the context, Jesus is speaking to a crowd of people. Verse 7 tells us that. He's speaking to crowds of people, and he's offering this incredible invitation that you can come to me and follow me and find rest. I don't know if you've noticed this in the past couple of passages we've looked at, but I want you to notice something with me. Every time Jesus offers this invitation, it is for you. Sometimes I read passages like this and I think, yeah, that's for somebody else. That's for Matthew or Levi and Peter and Andrew. No, it's for you. He wants you to follow him. He wants you and me to be his disciples. His call is for anyone and everyone. It doesn't matter how much you have in your bank account. It doesn't matter what school you go to or where you work or your status or your race. It doesn't matter any of that. He wants you. And I will tell you, I will never get over the fact that Jesus, God in the flesh, wants me. He knows my life. He knows what I've done. He knows all my past. But he wants you and he wants me. And I want you to make that personal, to know that he wants you. But there is a cost. We got to come to Jesus. Look at verse 28. Jesus says, "Come to me." That doesn't happen by proxy. Like, we have to do something. We have to be active in seeking him. We have a part to play. If we want the blessings of discipleship, I've got to come. If you look at the basic definition of that word, it means simply to move towards something. If we're going to be disciples, we've got to go to him. He wants us, but we've got to make that choice to come to him, to be partakers of those blessings, to be motivated by his love that we talked about this morning, to be motivated by his grace and his care for me. We've got to come. Number 2, I've got to take his yoke upon you. That's not like a word we use all the time. To take his yoke upon you. Y'all know what a yoke is? It was used in the Bible essentially to bind 2 animals together, like 2 oxen or other kind of animals, so that they could do work together or pull some kind of load, or a plow to plow a field. And they would yoke them together because it would allow them to do a work that only one oxen couldn't do by itself. And maybe you're wondering, well, what does that have to do with discipleship? When you think about putting Jesus' yoke upon you, like, if you get that image, that's not a very appealing image, I guess. To have something like that on you. But when you think about the beauty and the power of that message behind it, it makes it all the more incredible. Because what Jesus is talking about is submission. He's talking about that we can submit our lives to him. We don't have to wear the yoke of sin or other things. We can wear his yoke that he says is easy, his burden is light. The Jews used this language to talk about submission to a rabbi's teaching in the first century. And that's true of us today. If we're going to follow Jesus, we have to submit ourselves to what he tells us and what he teaches us, which leads to my third point. I've got to learn from him. The word disciple literally means a learner. We're adopting his teaching. We're taking on his teaching in our life. When we look at Jesus, we learn so much from him. We learn righteousness. We learn sacrifice. We learn faithfulness and obedience and all these kinds of things. We have to learn that from him. And so I would ask you, as a disciple, are you learning from him? As you sit through Bible classes and sermons week in and week out, are you learning from him? Are we just checking a box? Or are we learning from him to be the kind of people he wants us to be? And that comes at a cost. And not just learning about him, but learning of him. Truly knowing him and truly learning who he is and who he calls me to be. But if we'll do that, this is the blessing. I can have rest. If I choose to follow Jesus and submit my life to him, I can have rest for my soul. Think about who Jesus is talking to here. Did you notice that? Who does he call? Those who are weary and heavy laden. Is that where you're at this morning? Is that where you're going to be this week, this month, this year? Jesus is talking to people like you and me who are tired and worn out from the blows of life that just keep coming and coming and coming and coming. Jesus is talking to people who are crushed under the burden and the weight of sin. He's talking to people who are carrying around like a backpack all of their past, the shame and the guilt and the regret. He's talking to people who feel imprisoned from their mistakes. He's talking to people like you and me who feel anxious and concerned about things that are going on in the world, things that are going on in our lives, people who are weary and heavy laden. And Jesus says, come to me and you will find rest. Not just rest like we think about rest, like on a vacation, or finding some kind of rest we think the self-medicating from a bottle. Not rest as sitting on the couch and watching your favorite YouTube series or Netflix. Rest for your soul. And only he can give that to you. The rest Jesus offers has nothing to do with mattresses or beds or vacations. It is rest for weary souls to find peace and joy and comfort. You can find rest in Jesus because he forgives us and pardons us and makes us whole again. We can find rest because through Jesus I can have fellowship with God. I'm no longer set apart. And we can find rest in Jesus when we look at the world as it's crumbling to pieces to know I have a hope that doesn't hinge on what happens here. I have a hope in heaven with God. And so Jesus gives us rest for our souls that we so desperately long for. I was just thinking earlier, yesterday, about this passage. Jesus is talking to a crowd of people. I want you to try to, just for a moment, envision what that was like. Here's Jesus and a crowd of people, and he's giving this message to people who are weary and heavy laden, saying, come to me and I will give you rest. Try to imagine being there. You know what it's like to be in a crowd. It's hectic and it's crazy and it's difficult to even navigate your way through. And I can just imagine someone in that crowd being towards the back of the crowd and thinking, yeah, that sounds great. There's no way I can get through the crowd. There's no way I can come to Jesus. Maybe I'll do that some other day, but not today. And so they were intimidated by the crowd, and so they don't get the rest that he offers. Every day, you and I have a crowd that has the potential to keep you and me from the rest that we need. Not a physical crowd. Jesus is not in the flesh, but stuff. Just things that we have every day, things that we can look at, things that we have. And sometimes we look at Jesus, we're in the crowd and everything in between us, and we miss out on the rest that he offers us because we're consumed by those things. A fellow preacher shared this image that was so fitting. And I want you to think about, is something in this that's your crowd? Maybe it's the appointments you have every day. Maybe it's bills. None of these things are necessarily wrong in themselves. Maybe it's Facebook, social media, TV, whatever it is. Somewhere there is your crowd. And the thing that we have to do every day when we wake up is to push the crowd aside, to be intentional about getting through that crowd so that we can find the rest that we need in the Lord. And that comes at a cost. That means that we have to put aside some of those things in order to find the rest that we need. And so coming to Jesus, we find rest for ourselves. And so when Jesus calls a man, he bids him to come and die. But I want you to think about what we're dying to. We die from a life of aimlessness and purposelessness to a life of purpose and meaning and value. We die to a life of sin and futility to find healing and forgiveness. We die to a life of burdens that are weighing us down to find rest for ourselves. Is that what you want this morning? Are you ready to count the cost? Become a disciple of Jesus and give him the entirety of your life. You can have the blessings of discipleship if you'll come to him. Maybe you need to do that this morning and become a Christian and become a child of God. Or maybe just as a disciple, you're struggling with the walk of discipleship and need encouragement. I know I will be back there and the elders will be back there. If we can help you in making that choice, let that be known as we stand and sing the song of invitation.